Theodore Roosevelt was a New York aristocrat and a dynamic political figure who became one of the most transformative presidents in American history. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 26th President of the United States, was born in New York City on October 27, 1858. He came from a wealthy and prominent family. He had a distinctive appearance with his thick mustache and pince-nez spectacles. Roosevelt's early years were marked by physical frailty and intellectual curiosity. He suffered from severe asthma as a child, a condition that often left him gasping for breath and confined to his bed. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., encouraged him to build up his body through vigorous exercise. Young Theodore embraced this challenge with characteristic determination, transforming himself from a sickly child into a robust young man through boxing, hiking, and other strenuous activities. Roosevelt attended Harvard College, graduating in 1880. His education there shaped his understanding of history, natural science, and public service, though his later career would test those lessons in ways he could never have imagined. At Harvard, he was known for his boundless energy and wide-ranging interests. He studied biology, wrote papers on naval history, and began work on what would become his first book, The Naval War of 1812. His academic performance was strong, though not exceptional, as he preferred practical learning to theoretical study. In 1880, Roosevelt married Alice Hathaway Lee, a beautiful young woman from a prominent Boston family. The marriage seemed to promise a life of domestic happiness and social prominence. Roosevelt enrolled in Columbia Law School but quickly found legal study tedious and uninspiring. He was drawn instead to politics, a field that his social class typically avoided as beneath their dignity. In 1881, at the age of 23, Roosevelt was elected to the New York State Assembly as a Republican. He was the youngest member of the legislature and immediately made his presence felt with his aggressive reform agenda and his willingness to challenge corrupt political machines. Roosevelt's early political career showed promise and attracted attention. He fought against corruption in both parties and championed civil service reform. His high-pitched voice and aristocratic manner made him an easy target for ridicule, but his determination and moral courage earned respect even from political opponents. He was building a reputation as an honest reformer willing to take on powerful interests. Then tragedy struck with devastating force. On February 14, 1884, both Roosevelt's mother and his wife died in the same house on the same day. His mother succumbed to typhoid fever while his wife died of kidney failure just hours after giving birth to their daughter, Alice. Roosevelt was shattered by the double loss. In his diary that day, he drew a large X and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." The grief was overwhelming and nearly broke him. Unable to bear remaining in New York with its painful memories, Roosevelt fled west to the Dakota Territory. He had previously invested in cattle ranching there and now threw himself into the hard physical life of a rancher and cowboy. For 2 years, he lived in the Badlands, riding horses, hunting, and working alongside cowboys. The experience transformed him. The harsh landscape and demanding work helped him process his grief while reinforcing his belief in the strenuous life. He learned to rope cattle, survived a blizzard, captured outlaws, and earned the respect of rough frontiersmen who initially dismissed him as an Eastern dude. The ranching venture ultimately failed financially. The brutal winter of 1886 to 1887 killed most of his cattle, wiping out his investment. However, the experience gave Roosevelt something more valuable than money. It gave him a connection to the American West and its people that would influence his conservation policies and his political identity. The cowboy Roosevelt became part of his public image, distinguishing him from other Eastern politicians. In 1886, Roosevelt returned to New York and attempted a political comeback, running for mayor of New York City. He finished third in a three-way race, a humbling defeat. That same year, he married Edith Kermit Carow, a childhood friend. The marriage was happy and stable, providing Roosevelt with the domestic foundation he needed. Edith would bear him 5 children to add to Alice, his daughter from his first marriage. The Roosevelt household was boisterous and energetic, reflecting Theodore's own personality. After his mayoral defeat, Roosevelt focused on writing and public service in appointed positions. He wrote prolifically, producing books on American history, biography, and his Western experiences. His writing was vigorous and readable, appealing to popular audiences. He also accepted appointment to the United States Civil Service Commission in 1889, where he fought against the spoils system and advocated for merit-based government employment. His aggressive enforcement of civil service laws made him enemies but also enhanced his reputation as a reformer. In 1895, Roosevelt became president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. He threw himself into the role with typical energy, conducting midnight rambles to catch officers sleeping on duty and fighting against corruption in the police department. His reforms were significant but also generated fierce opposition from Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that controlled much of New York City politics. Roosevelt's tenure was marked by constant battles and mixed results, but it kept him in the public eye. When William McKinley was elected president in 1896, Roosevelt sought appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He received the position in 1897 and immediately began advocating for naval expansion and modernization. Roosevelt believed that American power required a strong navy capable of projecting force globally. He studied naval strategy, pushed for new ship construction, and prepared the Navy for potential conflict. His superior, Secretary of the Navy John Long, often found his assistant's enthusiasm overwhelming but generally allowed Roosevelt considerable latitude. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, Roosevelt was among those who pushed for war with Spain. When war was declared in April, Roosevelt resigned his position to join the fighting. He could have remained safely in Washington, but that was not his nature. He helped organize the first United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which became famous as the Rough Riders. The regiment was a diverse mix of Western cowboys, Eastern aristocrats, Native Americans, and college athletes, reflecting Roosevelt's vision of American unity across regional and class lines. Roosevelt was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel, second in command of the regiment. When the regiment deployed to Cuba in June 1898, Roosevelt was in his element. The Rough Riders saw action in several engagements, most famously the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898. Roosevelt led his men in a charge up Kettle Hill, adjacent to San Juan Hill, under heavy Spanish fire. The charge succeeded and Roosevelt's courage under fire became legendary. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, though the award was not granted until 2001, decades after his death, due to political complications. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but it made Roosevelt a national hero. He returned to New York in August 1898 to a tumultuous welcome. The Republican Party immediately nominated him for governor of New York. He won the election in November and took office in January 1899. As governor, Roosevelt pursued a progressive agenda, fighting corporate monopolies, improving working conditions, and reforming the civil service. His activism alarmed the Republican machine politicians who had supported his election, particularly Senator Thomas Platt, the state party boss. Platt and other party leaders decided to remove Roosevelt from New York politics by promoting him to the vice presidency. The position was traditionally seen as a political dead end, a place where ambitious politicians went to fade into obscurity. Roosevelt himself was reluctant to accept the nomination, recognizing it as an attempt to sideline him. However, at the 1900 Republican National Convention, the pressure to accept was overwhelming. President McKinley was nominated for a second term with Roosevelt as his running mate. They won the election easily in November 1900. Roosevelt assumed the vice presidency in March 1901, expecting years of ceremonial duties and political irrelevance. He found the position frustrating and boring, as he had feared. Then, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist assassin while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Roosevelt rushed to Buffalo, but McKinley initially seemed to be recovering. Roosevelt left to join his family on a camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains, believing the crisis had passed. On September 13, McKinley's condition suddenly deteriorated. Roosevelt was hiking in the mountains when a messenger reached him with news that the president was dying. He made a dramatic midnight ride down the mountain and traveled by train to Buffalo, arriving on September 14. McKinley had died early that morning. At age 42, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. the political establishment was shocked and concerned. Senator Mark Hanna, a powerful Republican leader, reportedly exclaimed, "Now look, that damned cowboy is president." Roosevelt moved quickly to reassure the nation and the Republican Party. He pledged to continue McKinley's policies and retain the cabinet. However, he soon began putting his own stamp on the presidency. Roosevelt believed the president should be a steward of the people, actively using federal power to promote the public good. This was a significant expansion of presidential authority that alarmed conservatives but energized progressives. One of Roosevelt's first major actions was intervening in the anthracite coal strike of 1902. When coal miners struck for better wages and conditions and mine owners refused to negotiate, Roosevelt threatened to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops. This unprecedented threat forced the owners to accept arbitration. The settlement gave miners modest gains and established the principle that the president could intervene in labor disputes to protect the public interest. It was a dramatic assertion of federal power. Roosevelt also aggressively pursued antitrust enforcement against large corporations. His administration filed suit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company, under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government in 1904, breaking up the company. Roosevelt became known as a trust buster, though his actual position was more nuanced. He distinguished between good trusts that served the public interest and bad trusts that exploited consumers. He believed in regulating corporate power, not destroying it entirely. In foreign policy, Roosevelt was an assertive nationalist who believed America should play a major role in world affairs. He famously said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," summarizing his approach of diplomatic negotiation backed by military strength. He dramatically expanded American naval power, sending the Great White Fleet on a world tour to demonstrate American might. He also intervened repeatedly in Latin American affairs, enforcing what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted America's right to intervene in the Western Hemisphere to maintain stability. Roosevelt's most significant foreign policy achievement was facilitating construction of the Panama Canal. When Colombia refused to grant the United States rights to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, Roosevelt supported a Panamanian independence movement. Panama quickly granted the United States control of the canal zone. Construction began in 1904 and the canal opened in 1914. Roosevelt considered it one of his greatest accomplishments, though the methods used to acquire the canal zone were controversial and damaged America's reputation in Latin America. Roosevelt also achieved diplomatic success by mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. His efforts earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, making him the first American to receive the award. He used the prize money to establish a trust for promoting industrial peace. The award enhanced Roosevelt's international prestige and demonstrated that America had become a significant player in global diplomacy. Domestically, Roosevelt championed conservation with unprecedented vigor. He established the United States Forest Service, created 5 national parks, and designated 18 national monuments. He protected approximately 230 million acres of public land, more than any president before or since. His conservation legacy reflected his love of nature and his belief that natural resources should be managed for future generations. He worked closely with Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, to develop policies balancing preservation with sustainable use. Roosevelt easily won election to a full term in 1904, defeating Democrat Alton Parker by a wide margin. His second term continued his progressive agenda. He pushed for the Hepburn Act, which strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission's power to regulate railroad rates. He supported the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906, which established federal regulation of food and medicine safety. These reforms responded to public concerns raised by muckraking journalists and represented significant expansions of federal regulatory power. Despite his progressive policies, Roosevelt remained fundamentally conservative on many issues. He believed in capitalism and private property, seeking to reform the system rather than replace it. He was skeptical of radical labor movements and socialism. His progressivism was pragmatic, aimed at preventing more radical change by addressing legitimate grievances and regulating corporate excess. This moderate approach satisfied neither conservatives who opposed any reform nor radicals who wanted fundamental restructuring of American society. In 1908, Roosevelt honored his pledge not to seek another term, though he was only 50 years old and at the height of his popularity. He supported William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, as his successor. Taft won easily, and Roosevelt departed for an extended African safari and European tour. He believed he was leaving the presidency in capable hands and looked forward to a life of writing, speaking, and adventure. However, Roosevelt soon became disillusioned with Taft's presidency. He believed Taft was too conservative and too close to the Republican Party's old guard. When Roosevelt returned to America in 1910, he began criticizing Taft's policies and advocating for more aggressive progressive reforms. The split between Roosevelt and Taft divided the Republican Party and set the stage for a dramatic confrontation in 1912. Roosevelt challenged Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. He won most of the primaries where voters could express their preference, but Taft controlled the party machinery and secured the nomination at a contentious convention. Roosevelt supporters walked out and formed the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party after Roosevelt declared himself as fit as a bull moose. The party platform called for extensive reforms including women's suffrage, social insurance, and stricter regulation of corporations. The 1912 campaign was dramatic and bitter. Roosevelt attacked Taft as a conservative tool of special interests while Taft portrayed Roosevelt as a dangerous radical. In October, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin while campaigning in Milwaukee. The bullet was slowed by the folded speech manuscript and eyeglass case in his pocket. Roosevelt insisted on delivering his scheduled speech before seeking medical attention, speaking for 90 minutes with a bullet in his chest. The incident enhanced his reputation for toughness but did not change the election's outcome. The split between Roosevelt and Taft handed the election to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt finished second with 88 electoral votes while Taft won only 8. The defeat was bitter for Roosevelt. His attempt to regain the presidency had failed and he had destroyed the Republican Party's unity in the process. The Progressive Party quickly faded after the election, unable to sustain itself without Roosevelt's personality to hold it together. After 1912, Roosevelt remained active but increasingly marginalized. He undertook a dangerous expedition to explore an uncharted tributary of the Amazon River in Brazil in 1913 to 1914. The expedition nearly killed him. He contracted malaria and a serious leg infection, losing considerable weight and permanently damaging his health. He returned to America weakened but still determined to remain relevant in public affairs. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, Roosevelt immediately advocated for American intervention on the side of the Allies. He criticized Wilson's neutrality policy as weak and cowardly. When America finally entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt sought permission to raise a volunteer division and lead it to France, as he had done in Cuba. Wilson denied the request, recognizing that the 60-year-old former president was too old and in too poor health for combat command. The rejection was humiliating for Roosevelt. Roosevelt's four sons all served in World War I. His youngest son, Quentin, was killed in aerial combat over France in July 1918. The loss devastated Roosevelt. He had always preached the virtues of courage and service, and his sons had answered that call. Quentin's death broke something in Roosevelt. He aged rapidly, his health declining noticeably. Roosevelt continued to speak and write, criticizing Wilson's conduct of the war and his plans for peace. He remained a powerful voice in Republican politics and was considered a leading candidate for the presidential nomination in 1920. However, his health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from inflammatory rheumatism, which caused severe pain and limited his mobility. He was frequently hospitalized. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at his home in Sagamore Hill, New York. He was 60 years old. The cause of death was a blood clot that had lodged in his heart. Vice President Thomas Marshall said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." The comment captured Roosevelt's combative spirit and his refusal to surrender to any challenge. Roosevelt's funeral was simple, as he had requested. He was buried in a small cemetery near Sagamore Hill. Thousands mourned his passing, recognizing that an extraordinary figure had left the stage. Even his political opponents acknowledged his significance and his impact on American life. Roosevelt's legacy is vast and complex. He transformed the presidency into a powerful office capable of addressing national problems. He established the federal government as a regulator of corporate power and a protector of public welfare. His conservation policies preserved millions of acres for future generations. His foreign policy made America a world power. His personality and energy redefined what Americans expected from their leaders. Yet Roosevelt's legacy also includes troubling elements. His racial views, while progressive for his time, were paternalistic and reflected assumptions of white superiority. His imperialism and interventionism in Latin America bred resentment and instability. His aggressive masculinity and celebration of war seem problematic in retrospect. His ego and ambition sometimes overwhelmed his judgment, as in his destructive split with Taft. Modern historians rank Roosevelt among the greatest American presidents, typically placing him in the top 5. They credit him with modernizing the presidency and the federal government, addressing the challenges of industrialization and urbanization, and positioning America for its 20th century role as a global power. His flaws are acknowledged but generally seen as secondary to his achievements. Perhaps Roosevelt's most enduring legacy is his example of energetic leadership and public service. He demonstrated that government could be a force for positive change and that leaders should actively address public problems rather than passively maintain the status quo. His belief in the strenuous life, in testing oneself against challenges, continues to inspire Americans. Theodore Roosevelt was a man of enormous contradictions. He was a wealthy aristocrat who championed the common people. He was an intellectual who celebrated physical courage. He was a conservationist who loved hunting. He was a peacemaker who glorified war. He was a progressive reformer who defended capitalism. These contradictions made him a complex figure but also a uniquely American one, embodying the nation's competing impulses and values. In the end, Theodore Roosevelt was neither a perfect president nor a perfect man, but rather an extraordinary leader who seized his historical moment and shaped it to his vision. His legacy includes both remarkable achievements and significant failures, progressive reforms, and problematic policies. He is remembered today as one of the most dynamic and consequential presidents in American history, a larger-than-life figure whose energy and vision transformed the nation and whose personality continues to fascinate more than a century after his death.